The neighborhood looked like any other from the outside, manicured lawns, fresh paint, and pristine sidewalks, but beneath the surface, the homeowners association ruled with an iron fist. Every mailbox was monitored, every hedge scrutinized, and every driveway measured against the HOA's arbitrary standards. To most residents, it seemed minor, even laughable, but for anyone who dared step out of line, it was a nightmare. I moved into the neighborhood with a sense of optimism, excited to join a community that seemed so neat, so orderly. I had dreams of weekend barbecues, friendly neighbors, and quiet evenings on my porch. But the illusion shattered the day I received the first letter. It was not a warm welcome, not a set of rules, but a fine, a penalty for non-compliance. The offense? My mailbox was not up to code. It was small, almost laughable. The mailbox was functional, even stylish. Yet, here it was, deemed illegal by the HOA. I thought it was a mistake, but as days passed, more letters arrived, fines for weeds, fines for the paint shade of my shutters, fines for not having the right type of welcome mat. Each letter carried a tone of authority so overbearing, it felt personal. At first, I tried compliance. I painted, I trimmed, I bought a new mailbox that matched the HOA's arbitrary rulebook. For a moment, I thought the ordeal was over, but it never was. One neighbor complained about the angle of my garden stones, another about the color of my flowers. Every action, no matter how insignificant, became a reason for harassment. The HOA had become a weapon, and I was the target. The absurdity reached its peak when they sent a notice demanding I remove my unauthorized bird feeder. They claimed it disrupted the uniform aesthetics of the community. I stared at the letter in disbelief. A bird feeder? Really? I had moved into what was supposed to be a safe, quiet neighborhood, and now I was being micromanaged like a child. The tension built steadily. Residents whispered about the HOA behind closed doors, sharing stories of fines that reached hundreds or even thousands of dollars. People were afraid to speak openly, terrified that the board would single them out next. The neighborhood had become a theater of fear, and the HOA directors were the directors, writing scenes where compliance was mandatory and rebellion punished. But within this oppressive environment, a seed of defiance started to grow in me. Every letter, every fine, every pointless restriction ignited a frustration I couldn't ignore. I watched the HOA with a careful eye, learning their patterns, noting their vulnerabilities, and slowly crafting a plan. The first step was observation. I paid attention to how the board operated, who had the power, and where their weaknesses lay. Meetings were held in an austere clubhouse with fluorescent lighting that made everything feel cold and official. Directors wore smiles that didn't reach their eyes, and residents sat quietly, nodding as if survival depended on silence. I watched, taking notes, mentally recording every procedural error and rule-bending instance. One discovery stood out immediately: the HOA's rules were inconsistently enforced. Some neighbors with clearly visible violations were never fined. Some had long-standing projects in violation of the aesthetic codes that nobody seemed to notice. This inconsistency, I realized, was a chink in their armor. It meant the system wasn't as flawless as it pretended to be, it was vulnerable. Over the next few weeks, I deepened my research. I read legal documents, reviewed the HOA's charter, and collected evidence of mismanagement. I documented everything meticulously: overcharged fines, skipped board approvals, unauthorized inspections, and procedural violations. The more I uncovered, the clearer it became: this was not just petty harassment. The HOA had overstepped its authority, and they were hiding behind intimidation and bureaucracy to control the neighborhood. It was during this research that I first felt the thrill of a plan forming. I wasn't going to let them bully me quietly. The community had been silenced for too long, and now, I had the tools to expose the cracks in their facade. The feeling was exhilarating, almost intoxicating. For the first time since moving in, I felt in control. The residents still whispered about the latest fine I received, unaware that I was plotting the ultimate reversal. I could feel the energy shifting, though subtly. The intimidation that had held the neighborhood in its grip was not absolute. With patience, strategy, and the right leverage, the entire oppressive system could be undone, not just for me, but for everyone trapped under their arbitrary rules. And so, with a mixture of anger, cunning, and excitement, I prepared for the next move. The stage was set. The players were unaware of the game about to unfold. What started as a simple mailbox dispute was about to escalate into a neighborhood-wide upheaval, one that would expose every weakness, every hypocrisy, and every abuse of power the HOA had hidden behind their pristine facades. I leaned back in my chair, reviewing my notes, a plan crystallizing in my mind. The retaliation would not be petty. It would be calculated, comprehensive, and devastating. They had underestimated me, as they had underestimated many before. But this time, there would be no apologies, no compromises, no fines that could intimidate me. The quiet hum of the neighborhood outside my window was deceptive. On the surface, everything seemed normal. But in the shadows, a storm was brewing. And I was at the center of it. The first chapter of the battle had ended with my observation complete, my evidence gathered, and my resolve hardened. The next step was execution, and once it began, the HOA would never see it coming. The days leading up to the plan felt heavy with anticipation, as if the entire neighborhood was unknowingly holding its breath. The HOA continued its routine assault, letters, fines, inspections, but their efforts barely registered anymore. I had crossed the threshold from frustrated homeowner to strategist, and the power had shifted. Quietly, invisibly, but decisively. The plan hinged on one simple truth: systems that rely on fear collapse the moment someone stops being afraid. The HOA had built its empire on silence and compliance, but once a resident dared to challenge them openly, and legally, the entire structure would wobble. I knew that once I made my move, the effect wouldn't just hit the board, it would ripple through every street, every cul-de-sac, every neatly trimmed yard. The foundation of the HOA's authority rested on the illusion that they followed the rules. But in the stack of evidence I had collected, there were pages full of violations, procedural errors, financial inconsistencies, and board actions that bypassed the bylaws entirely. The more I read, the more it became clear, the HOA had been operating like a private kingdom, rewriting rules to suit their whims. And now, those same rules would become their downfall. The crucial discovery came one rainy evening as I sifted through the HOA's financial statements. Numbers that should have aligned didn't. Fees collected had no corresponding projects. Maintenance charges appeared for work that never happened. The board had been using resident fines and fees for personal expenses disguised as community improvements. It was the crack I needed, the one piece that could dismantle everything. The next step was contacting the state HOA oversight office. I filed a formal complaint supported by every document I had gathered, every inconsistency highlighted, every procedural failure catalogued. It was a slow, methodical move, one the HOA wouldn't even see coming. Oversight agencies rarely intervened, but when presented with clear evidence of mismanagement and misuse of funds, they had no choice but to investigate. Behind the scenes, the wheels began turning. Quiet inquiries were made, unnoticed by the board. Inspectors reviewed reports, checked documentation, and compared resident testimonies. The HOA was oblivious, still sending me petty fines that now served as evidence of harassment. Each envelope felt like fuel, feeding the fire that would eventually consume their authority. But the real breaking point, the move that shattered the entire system, was not the audit itself. It was the special meeting I called using a rule buried deep within the bylaws: any resident, with enough signatures, could force the HOA to hold a public vote on board removal. It was a rule the board assumed nobody would ever notice, one they certainly never intended to be used. I spent days knocking on doors, speaking quietly with neighbors who had also suffered under the HOA's oppressive rule. Some were hesitant, still fearful. Others were eager, their frustrations simmering from years of being targeted. Slowly, signatures filled the page. One after another. By the end of the week, I had more than enough. When I submitted the petition, the board members' faces stiffened with disbelief. They tried to dismiss it, claiming improper formatting, insufficient signatures, anything to delay the inevitable. But my documentation was airtight. They were legally obligated to hold the meeting, and they knew it. The panic behind their eyes was unmistakable. They were losing control. The neighborhood buzzed with whispers. For the first time in years, people walked outside with a sense of hope instead of dread. The air felt lighter, as if the fear that once hovered over every doorstep was finally dissipating. The board tried their usual tactics, sending more fines, threatening legal action, accusing residents of disruption, but their intimidation no longer worked. The illusion was broken. When the day of the meeting arrived, the clubhouse overflowed. Residents who had avoided gatherings for years now showed up in full force, sitting in rows, standing in corners, filling every inch of space. The board members sat at their usual table, but the confidence they once displayed was gone. Their posture stiff, their eyes scanning the room nervously. The oversight investigators sat quietly at the back, observing. Their presence alone destabilized the board. The investigation had officially begun, and now, every word the board spoke could, and would, be used against them. The vote was swift. One by one, residents raised their hands. The majority was overwhelming. Nearly every seat turned against the people who had ruled the neighborhood with fear. The board members were removed instantly, stripped of authority and denied access to community funds pending the audit's outcome. For the first time since moving in, I felt the weight lift. The oppressive grip of the HOA had finally loosened. The board's downfall wasn't dramatic or loud. It was silent, methodical, and absolute. A system that had thrived on control crumbled because of a single rule they had overlooked, a rule I had used to dismantle their entire operation. After the meeting, the investigators approached me privately, thanking me for the detailed records. They said the findings were serious enough to consider legal action against the former board. Misuse of funds, procedural violations, unauthorized fines, everything was being scrutinized. The neighborhood was free, but the story wasn't over. Something unexpected was revealed at the end of the meeting, something deeper than the fines or the bullying. A hidden truth that hinted the board may not have been acting alone. There were documents missing, financial trails that led further than anticipated, and anomalies suggesting a much bigger problem beneath the surface. The HOA's collapse was only the beginning. The real mystery had just started to show itself, one that would force the entire community to confront what had been happening behind closed doors for far longer than anyone realized. The aftermath of the board's removal was surreal. Streets that had once felt tense and heavy with the weight of arbitrary rules now carried a strange, buzzing energy. People walked freely, neighbors greeted each other without suspicion, and children played in yards that had been scrutinized down to the last blade of grass. The HOA's iron grip had fallen, and for the first time, the community could breathe. But I knew the story wasn't over. The board's downfall had uncovered cracks, but the investigation hinted at deeper corruption. Missing financial records suggested someone had siphoned funds beyond what the HOA could explain, leaving a shadow of questions in the community. Their mistakes had been monumental, yet I sensed there was more they hadn't anticipated, me. I had become both a liberator and a detective, piecing together the puzzle they thought was hidden. Every meeting I attended, every document I reviewed, revealed more evidence of their schemes. Funds meant for community improvements had vanished, fines had been funneled into private accounts, and vendors had been paid for services that were never rendered. The network of deception was vast, but my collection of evidence was larger. With the board ousted and investigators involved, the final step was ensuring the neighborhood stayed free. I worked closely with residents to establish a temporary committee, a group elected by the community to oversee the HOA's functions while reforms were put in place. Rules that had once been weaponized for control were rewritten for fairness, transparency, and accountability. For the first time, the HOA was not an oppressor, it was a service to the people. Meanwhile, whispers of the board's reckoning spread quickly. Some former directors tried to hide, hoping to avoid legal repercussions. Others confronted reality with disbelief. The community, once silenced, now demanded answers. Every action of the previous board was scrutinized, every fine challenged. They were forced to face the consequences of years of unchecked power. I took special satisfaction in the little ironies. The petty fines they had sent me, the letters threatening action over minor cosmetic issues, the intimidation tactics that had dominated my life, they all became part of the public record. What had once been harassment was now proof of corruption, evidence that their reign was illegitimate. Residents laughed quietly as they looked through the letters, once fearful, now empowered by the absurdity of what they had endured. But the ultimate revelation was even more satisfying. During the final audit, investigators found financial irregularities so extreme that they hinted at criminal activity, embezzlement, falsified records, and unauthorized transfers. The board had thought themselves untouchable, operating behind a mask of civility, but the truth had a way of surfacing, unstoppable once it had been uncovered. The community celebrated quietly, cautiously, knowing that rebuilding trust and infrastructure would take time. Yet, the victory was unmistakable. The neighborhood had reclaimed its streets, its lawns, and its autonomy. Residents who had felt powerless for years finally understood the impact of courage paired with preparation. One person's determination had sparked a transformation that affected every home, every corner of the neighborhood, and every member of the HOA. In the weeks that followed, life returned to a new normal, but nothing was as it had been. The streets were cleaner, the meetings more transparent, and the residents more engaged. Families gathered without fear of judgment or fines, children painted murals on fences that had once been strictly uniform, and the community had a voice once denied. The HOA was no longer a tool of oppression, it had been reformed into a structure that served, protected, and supported its residents. As I walked down the familiar streets, I couldn't help but reflect on the journey. What began as a battle over a mailbox and minor fines had escalated into a complete upheaval of a system built on fear. I had learned patience, strategy, and the power of evidence. I had discovered that courage was contagious, and one person's refusal to comply could ignite a movement. The former board members faced investigations, fines, and, in some cases, legal consequences. But the neighborhood moved forward, stronger and more united than ever. Residents now understood the importance of vigilance and the value of questioning authority. They had learned that compliance at the expense of justice was never true peace. And as for me, I finally felt the satisfaction of closure. The storm had passed, and in its wake was clarity, justice, and freedom. The HOA, once a source of constant stress, had become a testament to the power of one person willing to stand up, document every violation, and execute a plan with precision. The final scene of the saga was quiet, almost cinematic, lawns basking in golden sunlight, neighbors chatting without fear, and the lingering reminder that systems can be challenged, rules can be rewritten, and the powerless can rise. The oppressive days were over, and in their place was a community that had taken control of its destiny. It was a victory not just for me, but for every resident who had ever felt silenced, threatened, or trapped by arbitrary authority. And the story of how one determined homeowner broke the entire system in one calculated move would be remembered long after the fines, the letters, and the fear had faded. The neighborhood was no longer theirs. It was ours.